Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is The Long Walk by Stephen King. Now, this was published in 1979, and this was originally published under King's pen name, Richard Bachman, and this is obviously an older edition of the book that I have because it says by Richard Bachman right there. Now, for those of you who don't know, early in Stephen King's career, he published several books under this pseudonym. Most of these he actually wrote before Carrie, which was his first published novel. Actually, I believe The Long Walk was written when he was a freshman in college. Now, I believe the reason that Stephen King published several of these earlier novels of his under this pseudonym is because, at the time, his publisher told him that he was only allowed to publish X amount of books in a given year under his actual name so as not to oversaturate the market. Now, King thought that was ridiculous, but truth be told, I kinda understand where his publisher was coming from. But I also heard that the reason he did it was because even this early on in his career, he was already starting to notice that he was becoming a household name, and he wanted to see if people were genuinely buying his books for the quality of the work, or just because of the name Stephen King. But I also heard it was because he felt that the writing style of these earlier books was not on the same level as the writing style of the books he was publishing at the time, like the aforementioned Carrie or Salem's Lot or The Shining. Now, the other books that Stephen King published under the name Richard Bachman are Rage, which was actually published before this, Roadwork, The Running Man, and Thinner. Thinner was the last Bachman book before King was outed as Bachman. Now, there were two other Bachman books after Thinner. There was The Regulators, and then there was Blaze, but he published those under the Richard Bachman pseudonym more as in-jokes at that point, because at that point, it was already common knowledge that King and Richard Bachman were the same person. Now, I also have The Long Walk in this collection here called the Bachman Books, which was published in 1985 and collects the first four Bachman books. Now, I actually already reviewed this book years and years ago, but I wanted to redo it because my old review, and I say this all the time whenever I do a re-review, my old review just kinda sucked. Now, this is probably my favorite of the books that Stephen King wrote as Richard Bachman, at least next to The Running Man, and this is also one of my top 10 favorite Stephen King books. Now, The Long Walk is a dystopian novel. A lot of people think it's set in the future, and it might be, but I've always interpreted the book as taking place more in an alternate universe. My reason for this is because there is a reference at one point to Germany bombing the east coast of the United States at the end of World War II, which didn't actually happen in real life. There's also a reference to an American soldier storming a German nuclear base in 1953, implying either another war with Germany, or perhaps in this novel's universe, World War II lasted a lot longer than it did in real life. My personal interpretation is that this book is taking place in sort of an alternate timeline where Germany might not necessarily have won the war, but they did enough damage to the United States that it forced the United States government to become tougher and meaner and more militaristic. Now, if this is taking place in an alternate universe, that is a possible link with Stephen King's Dark Tower series, but I'll talk about any possible Dark Tower connections that this book might have after I review the novel proper. But regardless of whether or not this book is set in the future or just some alternate universe, it's set in a world where every year the United States government holds a competition where 100 teenage boys have to walk in this marathon, and basically all they have to do is walk. But as they're walking, they're being followed by soldiers with guns. And basically these boys have to walk at a certain speed. If they get below this speed, they get a warning. They get a total of 3 warnings, and if they waste their 3rd warning, they get a ticket. And let's just say getting a ticket is not a good thing at all, and there can only be one winner or survivor of this competition. Now, the main character of the book is a 16-year-old boy named Ray Garrity, who signs up to be on the Long Walk, really for no other reason than the prize, because if you survive a long walk, the government gives you whatever you want. Now, both his mother and his girlfriend tell him to drop out of this, saying it's stupid, you're gonna get killed, but he doesn't listen to them. But as the novel goes on, he starts to realize, holy fuck, maybe I didn't want this. Especially when he ends up making friends on the Long Walk and sees all the friends that he makes end up dying, because again, there can only be one survivor. Now, The Long Walk is definitely one of my favorite dystopian novels. I would rank it right alongside stuff like George Orwell's 1984, or Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, or Anthony Burgess's A Clockwork Orange, or even Alan Moore's V for Vendetta. I know that's really high praise, but I really do think The Long Walk is an excellent example of the dystopian genre. I mean, you could poke holes in the story a little bit, like, okay, why would these boys even sign up for this, knowing that in all likelihood they're not going to make it? But the way I see it, there's probably so much propaganda promoting the Long Walk that it just draws these boys in, and it's not till it actually starts where they really start to realize just how horrible it is. And also, in the novel, it seems like this is something that's been going on for generations, so it seems like the Long Walk has just been accepted by this society as a normal thing. Now, in the book, you're never quite sure why the government does this. You're not sure if it's a form of population control, or if it's a way for this fictional American government to scare the shit out of its enemies by saying, this is what we do to our own people, so don't fuck with us. Or maybe there's like no more wars in the fictional universe of this story, and society is just so desperate for violence that this Long Walk is sort of society's way to get its violence fix. Now, some people have read sort of a Vietnam metaphor with this story, and I can definitely see that. Now, the book was published in the late 70s, but apparently the first draft of this book was written when King was a freshman in college, and that would have been the mid to late 60s, so I think you could definitely see a Vietnam parallel with this. Especially when you consider that the book is really about a bunch of young men being sent off to be murdered, but it's murder sanctioned by the government. And seemingly for no reason. Now, I'm not going to debate whether or not the Vietnam War was necessary, but given King's political views, I'm sure if you were to ask him, he would probably say it was unnecessary. So, I definitely saw an anti-war message in the book, and there's also one scene in the book where these two boys just can't take it anymore, like they can't walk anymore, so they stand there and let the soldiers shoot them, but before they do, they both flip the soldiers off, and maybe I'm overanalyzing here, but it almost feels like that was the whole counterculture movement personified in one scene. Now, I feel the main theme of the story is death, and how death is eventually gonna come for us all. Now, luckily most of us will live long, happy lives, and we are sort of blessed with the ignorance of when we're going to die, but in the case of the characters in this book, they know that they're all going to die eventually within, if not a couple of hours, then a couple of days. It's 100 young boys setting out on this walk knowing that only one of them is going to make it, and what's going to be left of the one survivor. And there's a strange irony to the story because throughout it, Garrity makes friends with some of these other boys, and they get into these deep philosophical conversations about life, but they all know that all but one of their lives is going to eventually be cut short. And as the story goes on, they start to wonder, was making friends not even stupider than signing up for the Long Walk to begin with? Like, eventually every friend you make on this long walk, either you're gonna watch them die or they're gonna watch you die. So death is just omnipresent throughout the story, and in a way these characters are being followed by the Grim Reaper in the form of these soldiers. Like, the soldiers in the story are essentially death personified. Now, there's a character in this book named Peter McVise. I'm probably butchering his last name, but he basically becomes Garrity's best friend in the novel, and actually saves his life at a few points in the book, but again, is he not just prolonging the inevitable? But he's an interesting character because you find out that the reason he signed up to be on the Long Walk was because he was borderline suicidal after a relationship with this girl didn't work out. But Garrity and Peter form this whole group of friends that they call the Musketeers, but you start to see the fallacy of them doing that because you see this group get smaller and smaller as the novel goes on. Now, in the book, there's this character named Barkovich, who you could say is sort of the main villain of the novel, because he's intentionally antagonistic to all the other boys, and Barkovich is just a freaking shithead. Like, if this kid were real, I would want to punch him in the back of the head. But you start to wonder, is Barkovich not the smart one? Because he's the one who seems to be going out of his way not to make friends, and maybe that's the smartest thing you can do on the Long Walk. And then you have the character of Stebbins, who in my opinion might have been the most compelling character in the book. And he's also kind of an antagonist as well. He's an interesting character because there are points where he's very talkative with Garrity, but then there are points where he's almost just as much of an asshole as Barkovich. But he's a very complex character, and there is a very interesting revelation about this character towards the end of the novel. You also have a character in this book named Colin Parker, who starts off very antagonistic, especially towards Garrity, but as the novel goes on, he does develop into a fairly likable character. Like, he's still a dick, but he's sort of an honorable dick. Like, he's an asshole, but he at least apologizes for how much of an asshole he can be. And him and Garrity do eventually develop sort of an uneasy friendship. Now, there are a lot of other characters in the book that I'm skipping over. Those are just the characters that really stood out to me. Now, The Long Walk definitely is a dystopian novel, but to me this is also very much a horror novel. I know some people would probably say, oh, it's not horror, it's science fiction. There's science fiction in it, but you can't tell me this isn't horror. Maybe it's horror on a different level than some of King's other stories, but I do consider The Long Walk to be sort of an existential horror story. Like, there is some horrific shit in this book, and in some cases, literally. There's a point in this book where a kid gets diarrhea, but it's diarrhea that costs him his life. There's also a scene in this book where this kid, who has gone pretty much clinically insane at this point, gets shot in the stomach and his intestines fall out everywhere. But what's really horrifying about this scene is he's actually still alive after that for a brief period. There's also a scene where another character who has also gone clinically insane at this point tears out his own throat. So yeah, this is absolutely a horror novel, and it's also just such a grueling novel as well. Like, reading the book, my feet fucking hurt while reading it, even though I was sitting on my ass while reading this book, because it really does put you in the mind of these characters, and you feel like you're walking this long distance with these characters, and yeah, like, it honestly feels like a day in hell. Like, you completely understand why certain characters are going insane at this point, and this is also probably one of King's most bleak novels as well. Now, as I said before, I kind of view this book as taking place more in an alternate present as opposed to the future, and if this is taking place in an alternate universe, that is a possible connection with the Dark Tower series. Now, of course he did write this before he wrote Dark Tower, so obviously any connections that this would have with the Dark Tower series would be more serendipitous, but he did start working on The Gunslinger, which was the first Dark Tower novel, when he was 19. Now, The Dark Tower is a sci-fi fantasy series that deals with the concept of a multiverse, this idea that there are all these different parallel universes and alternate timelines timelines and other dimensions, and virtually all of Stephen King's other books and short stories are supposed to tie in with the Dark Tower series in some way, shape, or form. For example, Father Callahan from Salem's Lot showed up in the final 3 Dark Tower books, the Turtle from It showed up in the Dark Tower series, and in Dark Tower there are these characters with these psychic powers known as the Touch, and the Touch could potentially be the Shining. So, keeping that in mind, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to assume that maybe Long Walk is taking place on one of the many parallel Earths that are talked about in the Dark Tower series. Now, in the novel, there's a scene where Garrity sees a dark figure standing on the road, and I think Stephen King intentionally leaves the dark figure ambiguous and leaves it up to the reader's interpretation. Now, if you wanted to, you could interpret this as just being a figment of Garrity's imagination, because at the point he sees it, his mind is already starting to snap because of lack of sleep and all the death and carnage that he's seeing around him. But if you wanted to interpret it as something supernatural, there are several interpretations you could make. One is that the dark figure is actually the Grim Reaper, who has come there to take the souls of the boys killed on the Long Walk to either heaven or hell, and that would actually make sense because, again, death is a major theme in the story. But one fan theory that I have, and this is another possible Dark Tower connection, is that the dark figure is actually Randall Flagg, who is a major villain from the Dark Tower series. Now, Randall Flagg is sort of Stephen King's representation of the devil. He's not Satan himself, but he's sort of implied to be Satan's right-hand man. And he's also the main villain of The Stand and The Eyes of the Dragon, and he's shown up in several of Stephen King's other books like Hearts in Atlantis and Gwendy's Button Box. But keep in mind, that idea that the dark figure that shows up in this story is Randall Flagg, that's purely a fan theory. That's nothing that Stephen King has ever confirmed himself. But again, the dark figure is intentionally left ambiguous, so I don't think there's a right or wrong interpretation. You could even interpret it as maybe being the ghost of one of the boys killed on the Long Walk. Now, Stephen King's book, The Running Man, which he also published under the pen name Richard Bachman, is also a dystopian novel that is actually very similar to this. It is different, but there are a lot of thematic similarities. But I also highly recommend The Running Man. Now, these aren't by Stephen King, but later on you would have stuff like Battle Royale and The Hunger Games, which are actually very similar to this. You could say that maybe those properties were inspired by this in some way, but if you are a fan of Battle Royale or The Hunger Games, then definitely give The Long Walk a read. But again, The Long Walk is an excellent dystopian novel and an excellent horror novel, and it's definitely one of Stephen King's best. Now, they've been trying to do a film adaptation of this book for years. Apparently at one point in the late 80s, George Romero was going to do an adaptation of this. Now, I've read that on Wikipedia, so take that with a grain of salt, but it wouldn't surprise me because George Romero and Stephen King were friends in the 80s, and George Romero and Stephen King, of course, worked together on Creepshow. But of course, that never came to fruition. Now, for the longest time, Frank Darabont actually had the rights to this book, and he was going to do an adaptation of it, and dear God, I wish he could have, because I still think Frank Darabont is probably the best person to ever adapt any of Stephen King's work. He also directed The Shawshank Redemption, The Green Mile, and The Mist, all of which are based on Stephen King's stories. Unfortunately, that never came to fruition, but recently New Line Cinema purchased the rights to the book, and the person who's attached to direct this upcoming adaptation of The Long Walk whenever it happens, I can't pronounce the director's name, but he also directed movies like Troll Hunter and The Autopsy of Jane Doe and Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. So hopefully we'll get an adaptation of this book at some point in the future. Now, this is the last point in the video where you're going to see me. Now I want to cut to 2 short reviews that 2 friends of mine did on this book.
Hello. My friend Christian has asked me to do a short review of the Stephen King book, The Long Walk. I have it here collected in the Bachman books because it's one of the early novels that he had originally published under the pen name Richard Bachman, and then later released them in this collection under his own name. The Long Walk is actually my favorite of the Bachman books, and one of my favorite Stephen King books. It's set in a future dystopian society where people are so desperate, so in need, that they take place in this cruel, grueling contest where it's just basically a march. You just have to walk, and you have to maintain a certain speed, and if you fall below that speed too many times, you get shot and killed. And the winner of the contest is the person who makes it the longest, the only one who survives at the end. It's a very dark novel, but it is very compelling. It's very readable. You feel like you were there on that march with those characters. You feel their desperation. You feel what's driving them to try to do this. It's just an absolutely spectacular book that is gripping. It's a very short novel. It's very tightly paced. I read it in a day. I highly recommend that you seek out the Bachman books. Actually, all of these novels in here are really good. There's Rage, which you can only get in the older editions because Stephen King took it out because it has to do with like school violence. But I think it's worth reading. The Running Man, which was made into a Arnold Schwarzenegger movie that has very little to do with the book, but it's fantastic. Road Work, but The Long Walk, that I think is a masterpiece, and you should definitely try it. I hear they're trying to get a movie made of it now. I know for years Frank Darabont tried to get a movie made, and I would have loved to have seen what he did with it. But it is a fantastic novel. Definitely check it out.
If you ask me what we should do as a society to fix the problems we have with the younger generation, I will give you a copy of The Long Walk by Stephen King. Go, shh, then disappear into the night like an old Penny Dreadful character. No, I'm kidding. Or am I? Anyway, so The Long Walk, Stephen King. I've always felt that the books released under the name Richard Bachman are among the greatest books Stephen King has released. And if I had to rank the Bachman books, I would put this one right under The Running Man. It's great. It reminds me of The Running Man only in the sense that there's a competition where the losers die, but this one involves kids. I couldn't believe how violent and horrifying the deaths got in this book. I mean violent. And sad too. You get angry at the fact that this would be allowed to happen to anybody, and that circumstances would be so bad that kids would feel obligated to participate in such an event in order to get a prize at the end. Especially since you know these kids, you get to really know them. They are well-rounded characters. Not one flat note anywhere when it comes to the characters. And you feel terrible when things happen to them. Whether it's getting shot or catching a case of explosive diarrhea or getting their head smashed in, it's shocking. If memory serves me correctly, I believe Stephen King meant this to be a metaphor for war. But even if he didn't mean it to be a metaphor for war, it certainly seems like it. Young people volunteering to march for a certain need or cause and risking their life in the process. I won't get too political. I have my views on war and militaries and governments, and I know you have your own, but I think we can all agree that death is always tragic, and Stephen King proves that brilliantly in The Long Walk. The writing, it's a Stephen King book, so you know his prose style is always going to be top-notch. Pacing is very good. It's a very engaging story. It'll be so hard to put down. You might find yourself staying up all hours of the night because you don't want to stop reading. Believe me, I did. I read this book in probably, two days, maybe 3 days at the most. Can't really remember, but it was definitely somewhere around there. And the dialogue is very believable. And overall, yeah, this is a great read. Anybody interested in Stephen King or anybody who's a fan of books like The Hunger Games or Battle Royale or any of those types of competition books where kids die or people die, those teen books or anything like that, definitely check this book out. I promise you, you won't regret it.